Welcome to the Fair Trade Trios in Focus series. In each of these events, we will highlight a contemporary work that is new to our repertoire this season. We'll perform each work twice while giving you information about the composer, their musical approaches, and our impressions of the piece along the way. We know that listening to a new piece in the middle of a concert can go by so fast, so we hope that this series gives you the opportunity to get to know these pieces and start to love them as much as we do. Enjoy the program.
Tonight's In Focus will feature American composer Brittany J. Green's Intersections. Green describes the work as a concept piece representative of the finite yet infinite nature of moments where paths are crossed. The graphic score consists of 4 intersecting staves with no indicated beginning or end. Rather than specifying instrumentation, dynamics, or tempo, Green leaves the interpretation open to each individual performer. Intersections highlights the beauty of musicians reacting and interacting in the moment, enjoying the times where their parts may briefly align before they diverge on separate paths once again. Tonight we will present 2 different performances of Intersections and an interview with the composer. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in tonight. And I'm really happy to have the composer of this piece, Intersections, Brittany Green, with us tonight. Brittany, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me and for playing my piece. I'm very excited.
Of course. Everybody just heard a first listen of your piece, Intersections. Can you give me a little background on this piece? Like, when was it written and stuff like that?
Sure. So I wrote this piece in 2017, and it's a piece for open instrumentation, meaning that any chamber ensemble can perform it regardless of the instrumentation. I've even had people do versions of the piece for as a solo for an instrument like piano or something like live electronics, where you can kind of incorporate multiple moving lines as a singular player. And the piece is also what I would call a graphic score, in that it doesn't look like a traditional notated score that you would typically see, but instead it kind of has a visual element to it. And the piece itself is really just kind of exploring the idea of these intersecting lines of material that weave in and out of each other. And it also explores the idea of context and what does it mean to have the same line of musical material in terms of contour and shape, but have it in different contexts. And those different contexts being if the performers are playing it forward or backwards, if they're playing the same contour on the treble clef versus the bass clef, things like that, different registers for the instruments, different transpositions for instruments depending on the instrumentation of the ensemble. So those are kind of the overarching ideas of the piece.
Awesome. I thought if I could share a little bit about how I felt as a performer seeing it for the first time. I almost find what's interesting is that when you have less restraint, sometimes I almost do like one thing and I only do one thing. So I thought it was interesting when we worked on it was to go outside of our bubble and to write down. I know for myself, I wrote down like, here are all the things that I could do, and just tried out different things in the moment. But I almost had to write down all the things that I could do so I didn't get stuck in like one mindset as I was doing it. I was like, man, I've just played like really long notes the whole time and I've only done bass clef or something like that. So I find that's really interesting. The more open a piece might be, sometimes the more focused I end up as a performer.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had the experience or the opportunity to experience the piece both as the composer and then returning to it as a performer. I recently worked with an ensemble to do a performance of the piece as a performer myself, so that was interesting. Returning back to this piece that I wrote like 4 years ago. So I was kind of removed enough from it as a composer that I felt like I was kind of really approaching it with fresh eyes as a performer. And that is one of the beauties of the piece is kind of it shows you like what your kind of tendencies are as a performer, and it gives you the opportunity that you can either make that a highlight of your rendition of the piece, or you can challenge yourself to kind of do something new and explore something new. And I find that each time you approach the piece, there's another path or another interpretation there that you can kind of uncover, and so it kind of gives you a different experience every time.
Absolutely. I know when we started rehearsing the first couple times, we would just let it go and not say anything before we started and do a couple tries of that. And as we worked on it more, we tried different things of setting intentions before we went. I know for this particular project, because we knew that we'd have the opportunity to let our audiences hear it twice, I think we set like very broad points for those two because we did want them to sound very quite different, or to show the range of what the piece can be, I think, in its openness. But yeah, rehearsals were really interesting, trying different things because again, we didn't want to control it too much, right? You don't want to be like, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do pizzicato here, and then add, right? You want to leave it open enough and have that journey, because I think the experience of the journey is so important in this piece. It feels like to me as a performer.
Yeah, absolutely. And also just kind of leaving space for your ensemble members that you're performing with. And so it really challenges you to not, kind of like you said, overplan or try to put too much in the sound space, which I know is always something that's something I have to fight against as a performer. Is like, no, just slow down, calm down. You know, you don't have to constantly be adding new kind of material in terms of texture and timbre. And so it really just kind of invites you to listen and be in sync as an ensemble and kind of respond in terms of aesthetic or texture, timbre, dynamics to what other people are playing, even if your line may be drastically different than the line that they're playing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting something you said about leaving space, because something we discovered really early on was when you get those lulls, the internal pressure to be like, oh, I should play something else, I should do something else. And so we really challenged ourselves to be in moments to be like, no, it's okay if you're not playing for a minute. That's okay. Like see how, like, listen, right? Rather than being so focused on, I don't know, it was tackling those inner bubbles in your stomach you get when you're nervous that something is happening that shouldn't happen, sort of embracing the moment and the space.
Yes, absolutely. That's a beautiful way to frame it, embracing the moment in the space and really just letting the musical material breathe. And that's obviously something that occurs in music that's more traditionally notated when we have rests or fermatas or long held notes. And those don't seem to give as much anxiety as when you're doing something that is a little more open-ended with, an element of improvisation. It's just like this fear of like, what if we come to a moment of dead silence, but really embracing, okay, if you do, that's fine. Like that can totally be a part of the piece, and that's okay. And it's about how you frame that silence with what you did before and what you do after, and you can totally make it a beautiful musical moment.
Another thing that I think is so interesting about this form is because you don't know what other people necessarily are going to do. The way that you listen to each other can feel so different. And at first you feel a little bit uncomfortable because you feel like you're trying to I felt a little bit in the beginning, it was so much cat and mouse. Like I'd hear one person do that and was like, oh, well, I'll imitate that or I'll do this. But it's interesting as it evolves, right? See, hearing how a note rubs against another note a little bit, or those moments where you magically align. How satisfying that is, because you don't know that it's about to happen until you're already in it. And kind of how amazing that is.
Yeah, I feel like we typically think of listening in an ensemble as kind of listening in the sense that it's serving a purpose for us and not necessarily us, like to facilitate our performance, and not necessarily listening out of curiosity of what the other person's going to play. Typically I'm listening for, okay, I'm waiting for that 16th note run that's going to be my cue for when I come in for my part. But with pieces like this, your approach to listening has to be a little bit different in that you're listening to hear what other people are doing, and then at the same time you're kind of thinking about how you can respond to that. And by respond, I mean not necessarily repeat what they just did, though that is certainly one of your options, but you could also support what they did. So if they're, playing something with their notes are moving a little bit faster rhythmically, you could be like a supporting sustained note under that. You could imitate what they did. You could decide, I'm going to make it my point to do something completely opposite of what they're doing and kind of shift the direction of the piece into a new direction. Or like you said, create like an interesting moment of tension between the parts. So it's just so interesting, all of these choices and how we're kind of listening and kind of making these decisions in real time as we approach pieces like this.
Absolutely. It was something that I noticed as we had worked on it, got to a more comfortable place with it, was, just like you're saying, moments when I hear maybe my colleague doing something and I want to support that and play along with it, but other moments when you're a leader. And that is so true of any piece of music, right? You have your moment when you have your solo or you take charge, or other moments that are more supportive and cohesive with the other lines. So it's interesting to see how all those things collide in a new way in this piece. Things we're already used to.
Absolutely. Yeah, and and when it's so interesting how the context of the piece just completely redefines those things for us, because when you think about it, I'm like, this is all stuff we already do, you know. We're just thinking of it in a different way because it's not explicitly laid out on the score, and there's more option for us as performers to kind of decide where those moments are. Like every piece of music has moments of tension and release, moments of support, moments where one instrumentalist is the leader, and moments where that same instrumentalist is kind of in a supportive role. But now with pieces like this, as ensemble players, we have the freedom to decide where those moments are, and do that in real time.
Yeah, and I remember a particularly beautiful thing where we got to the end, and I just was like, "Oh, this just worked so well," because we had times where you've done it where you were like, "Okay, this feels like this is winding down," and then somebody else like kicks it back up, and you don't. That moment when you're like, "Okay, how do we end this thing that is open?" Right? And there are times when it feels like, "Okay, that was a little awkward and bumpy this time getting out of it," but we had one time that we did it, and it's just like everybody, it just was perfect how everybody got to the same point at the same time. And I thought that was such a magical, intuitive moment that had happened.
Yeah, I always find that ending for me feels the hardest. Just knowing when everyone's done, like knowing, is this like a silence in the material, like a basically like a rest, or is this like the end of the piece? And then also sometimes starting can be difficult, kind of getting the ball rolling. But I always find that once things are moving and you've had a chance to settle into a groove as an ensemble, it really just becomes this very beautiful musical moment.
Absolutely. I think hearing other groups play this piece has been something so fascinating, because I feel like from the moment I hit play on somebody else's recording, I'm like, I never thought of that, or I never heard these sounds in my own performance. Like, that's so interesting how, looking at one score, you can create so many sound worlds and like you're saying, arcs or forms out of it. And it's just a really amazing experience.
Yeah, and that's my experience as a composer too. And even a lot of times I'll hear recordings of this piece and I'll be like, that was brilliant, and I never even imagined that kind of emerging out of the material that I wrote myself. So it very much feels like a collaboration for me, with each ensemble, even though it's kind of the same piece each time in terms of the score is the same. But like hearing each person's or each group's interpretation, it feels like, oh, that was a true collaboration. And that's one of the things I love about this piece, is it invites performers to collaborate with me in real time as they approach the piece.
Amazing. Well, I want to thank you so much for being here with us. I think it's incredible for our audience to be able to hear from the composer themselves. Before we go, I'd love to hear if you have any projects in the pipeline that you'd love to tell us about.
Absolutely. I do have a couple projects that I'm working on now. So I'm actually collaborating with the Emory University Symphony Orchestra to compose a piece for them that will be premiered in 2022 in April. And then I'm also working with a videographer here in Durham, North Carolina, Kate Alexandrite, on a project called Black Echoes, which will be a multimedia installation that explores some bamboo forest trails here in Durham, North Carolina, and kind of the history of that land and some imagined futures of that land. And that will also be premiered in 2022.
That's amazing. Those sound like some amazing projects to look forward to. So.
Yes, and thank you so much again for programming my piece and for having me here. I'm so excited that I was able to talk with you about it and also hear both of your interpretations of the piece.
Of course. Okay, so now we'll go to our second listen of Intersections by Brittany Green.